We are going live. We are live. Welcome back to this experimental live read from Adult Brain. I'm Graham, one of the narrators. I'm reading today Ancient America in Notes on American Archaeology by John Baldwin from 1871. Yesterday we did chapter 1, which was the Mound Builders. Now we are talking about the Antiquity of the Mound Builders, which is a short chapter 2. And then we'll probably get into chapter 3, who were the Mound Builders. So this is a pretty interesting book. There's lots of pictures in here. So we're just showing you that we are real people. We are not just AI. These books are read by me mostly and other people as well. But this is, I thought it'd be fun to just try an experimental live read. As I record it, this is how the sausage is made. This is rough and raw. I'm just doing the editing as I go. So I'm going to share my screen here and show you. I mean, this isn't exactly how I would do it because normally I'd have this on a full screen, probably a 2-page view, and this on a full screen so I can easily go back and forth. But this is good enough for this exercise, and I'll try to make not a lot of mistakes and go through it here. It's probably not quite as accurate as if I would do it in studio without being live. So yeah, here we go. This is how it's done. We'll see how far we can get today. Chapter 2, Antiquity of the Mound Builders. That the mound builders and their works belong to a distant period in the past is evident, but, of course, we have no means of determining their antiquity with any approach to accuracy, no scheme of chronology by which their distance from us in time can be measured. Nevertheless, some things observed in their remains make it certain that the works are very ancient. One fact showing this is pointed out by those who have examined them carefully as follows. None of these works, mounds or enclosures, occur on the lowest formed of the river terraces, which mark the subsidence of the western streams. And as there is no good reason why their builders should have avoided erecting them on that terrace, while they raised them promiscuously on all the others, it follows, not unreasonably, that this terrace has been formed since the works were erected. It is apparent also that in some cases the works were long ago partly destroyed by streams, which have since receded more than a mile. See, this is what I was wondering about the floods, right? About the Younger Dryas stuff. Like, are they saying that these floods from, 12,000 years ago? It is apparent also that is this what they're talking about? The works were long ago partly destroyed. I'm going to have to go back to that sentence there. The cat is no longer on my lap. Should I change positions? Hello, Sadie. Welcome from Italy. Let's see here. Check. Sadie's here, learning English as I go along. Now I got to go back. Terrace has been formed since the works were erected. Oh, I had it wrong. It's a good thing I double checked. All right. It is apparent also that in some cases the works were long ago partly destroyed by streams which have since receded more than half a mile, and at present could not reach them under any circumstances. I just have to stop it. That sounds like the stuff that we've looked at with Randall Carlson about the floods from 12,800 years ago. Like there's these valleys are so huge from that flood, supposedly. Those streams generally and the terraces are a lot where they make those, the wine benches in the Okanagan in Canada and the States are from these terraces that were left over, all these huge sedimental terraces. Anyways, I should stop commenting myself and just read, damn it. Circumstances. Those streams generally show 4 successive terraces, which mark 4 distinct eras of their subsidence since they began to flow in their present courses. The 4th terrace, on which none of the works are found, marks the last and longest of these periods. And it marks also the time since the mound builders ceased to occupy the river valleys where it was formed. The period marked by this 4th terrace must be the longest because the excavating power of such streams necessarily diminishes as their channels grow deeper. This geological change, which has taken place since the latest of the mounds and enclosures were constructed, shows that the works are very old. No one can tell how old. To count the years is impossible, but we can see that the date, if found, would take us back to a remote period in the past. Number two, great antiquity is indicated by the skeletons taken from the mounds. Every skeleton of a mound builder is found in a condition of extreme decay. It sometimes appears that the surface of a mound has been used by the wild Indians for interments, but their skeletons, which are always found well preserved, can be readily distinguished by their position in the mounds, as well as by other peculiarities. The decayed bones of mound builders are invariably found within the mounds, never on the surface, usually at the bottom of the structure, and nearly always in such a state of decay as to render all attempts to restore the skull, or indeed any part of the skeleton, entirely hopeless. Not more than one or two skeletons of that people have been recovered in a condition suitable for intelligent examination. It is stated in the work of Squire and Davis that the only skull belonging incontestably to an individual of the mound building race, which has been preserved entire, was taken from a mound situated on a knoll, itself artificially apparently. itself. Thanks, Sati. A lot of theories to see and consider. Yeah, I might make them as I go along a little bit. Okay, here we go. Itself artificial, apparently, on the summit of a hill in the Scioto Valley, 4 miles below Chillicothe. What, save time itself, can have brought these skeletons to a condition in which they fall to pieces when touched and are ready to dissolve and become dust? All the circumstances attending their burial were unusually. These these dashes in the old books are sometimes hard. All the circumstances attending their burial were unusually favorable for their preservation. The earth around them has invariably been found wonderfully compact and dry, and yet, when exhumed, they are in such a decomposed and crumbling condition that to restore them is impossible. Sound and well preserved skeletons known to be nearly 2,000 years old have been taken from burial places in England and other European countries less favorable preserve. Oh, that got me right at the end. I'm gonna have to redo that whole sentence. But it's a good sentence to redo because it's probably important that saying that these skeletons have been found otherwise 2,000 years old and are not nearly the same in the same condition. Sound and well preserved skeletons known to be nearly 2,000 years old have been taken from burial places in England and other European countries less favorable for preserving them. The condition of an ancient skeleton cannot be used as an accurate measure of time, but it is sufficiently accurate to show the difference between the ancient and the modern. And in this case, it allows us to assume that these extremely decayed skeletons of the mound builders are much more than 2,000 years old. Those familiar with the facts established by geologists and paleontologists are aware that remains of human skeletons have been discovered in deposits of the Age of Stone in Western Europe. Not to any great extent, it is true, although the discoveries are sufficient to show that fragments of skeletons belonging to that age still exist. It is not without reason, therefore, that the condition of decay in which all skeletons of the mound builders are exhumed from their burial places is considered a proof of their great antiquity. There is no other explanation which, so far as appears, can be reasonably accepted. Number three, the great age of these mounds and enclosures is shown by their relation to the primeval forests in which most of them were discovered. I say primeval forests because they seemed primeval to the first white men who explored them. Of course, there were no unbroken forests at such points as the Ohio Valley. Excuse me. Of course. At such points. Of course, there were no unbroken forests at such points as the Ohio Valley, for instance, while they were occupied by the Mound Builders, who were a settled agricultural people whose civilized industry is attested by their remains. If they found forests in the valleys they occupied, these were cleared away to make room for their towns, enclosures, mounds, and cultivated fields. And when, after many ages of such occupation, they finally left or were driven away, a long period must have elapsed before the trees began to grow freely in and around their abandoned works. Moreover, observation. Hmm. Hello from Texas, the Akashic Records show. Nice. Moreover, observation shows that the trees which first make their appearance in such deserted places are not regular forest trees. The beginning of such growths, as will cover them, with great forests comes later, when other preliminary growths have appeared and gone to decay. That just didn't feel right, that whole sentence. I got it. Sorry, I got to redo it. And that record level is coming down too far. The beginning of such growth. As we'll cover them. The beginning of such growths, as we'll cover them. The beginning of such growths, as we'll cover them with great forests, comes later, when other preliminary growths have appeared and gone to decay. When the Ohio Valley. When the Ohio Valley was first visited by Europeans, it was covered by an unbroken forest, most of the trees being of great age and size, and it was manifest that several generations of great forest trees had preceded those found. Ugh. And it was. Let's see. Let's do that one again too. It doesn't want to stay. I want it to be at least at 44. And it was manifest that several generations of great forest trees had preceded those found standing in the soil. The mounds and enclosures were discovered in this forest with great trees growing in them. 800 rings of annual growth were counted in the trunk of a tree mentioned by Sir Charles Lyell and others, which was found growing on a mound at Marietta. In the same way, successive generations of forest trees had grown over their extensive mining works near Lake Superior, and many of those works are still hidden in what seem to be primeval forests. General Harrison made the following suggestion in regard to the establishment of these forests in Ohio. When the individual trees that first got possession of the soil had died out one after another, they would, in many cases, be succeeded by other kinds, till at last, after a great number of centuries, that remarkable diversity of species characteristic of North America would be established. His suggestion, the result of practical observation and study, is not without reason. It is certain in any case that the period when these old constructions were deserted in so far back in the past is so far back in the past. It is certain in any case that the period when these old constructions were deserted is so far back in the past that sufficient time has since passed for the abandoned towns and fields to remain for years and perhaps centuries as waste places pass through the transition from wastelands to the beginning of forest growths, and then to be covered by several generations of such great forest trees as were cleared away to prepare the soil for the settlements, towns, and farms of our people. How long were they here? There are many indications to warrant the conclusion that the mound builders occupied their principal seats in the Ohio and Mississippi valleys during a very long period. If they came from the south, as appears evident, their settlements must have been extended up the valley gradually. After their first communities were established in the Gulf regions, considerable time must have elapsed before their advancing settlements were extended northward through the intervening region into the valley of the Ohio. On the Ohio and in the valleys of its tributaries, their settlements were very numerous and evidently populous. The surprising abundance of their works in this region, which have been traced in our time, shows that they dwelt here in great numbers and had no lack of industry. This region seems to have been one of the principal centers from which their settlements were advanced into the western part of Virginia, into Michigan, Wisconsin, Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, and Missouri. The spread of their settlements was necessarily gradual, and a long period must have been required to extend them all over the country where remains of their works are known to exist. If their civilization was chiefly developed after their arrival in the country, which is unlikely, many years must have elapsed before colonies went forth to any great extent from the original seat of its development. In any case, time was required to make their chief settlements sufficiently old and populous to send forth colonies. It is manifest in their remains that the communities of this ancient people most remote from the populous centers of the Ohio. Better redo that one. It is manifest in their remains that the communities of this ancient people, most remote from the populous centers on the Ohio, east, north, and west, were, like all border settlements, the rudest and least populous. The remains at these points do not indicate either as much wealth or as many workers, and the places where these borderers settled must have been the latest occupied and the earliest abandoned. One diligent investigator who believes they came originally from Mexico speaks of the time of their stay in the country as follows. When we consider the time required to people the whole extent of the territory where their remains are found and bring that people into a condition to construct such monuments, and when we reflect on the interval that must have passed after their construction until the epoch of their abandonment, we are constrained to accord them a very high antiquity. He points out that they were sun worshippers like the Mexicans and Peruvians, and calls attention to the discs dug from their mounds, which appear to have been designed as representations of the sun and moon. Their long occupation of the country is suggested by the great extent of their mining works. All who have examined these works agree with Colonel Whittlesey that they worked the Lake Superior copper mines for a great length of time. How long had they dwelt in the Ohio Valley when this mining began cannot be told, but a very considerable period must have elapsed after their arrival at that point before the mines were discovered. We cannot suppose the first settlers who came up from the Gulf region to the Ohio Valley went on immediately through the wilderness 1,000 miles to hunt for copper mines on Lake Superior. And even after they began to explore that region, some time must have passed before the copper was found. After they discovered the mines and began to work them, their progress could not have been rapid, as their open trenches and pits could be worked only in the summers and by methods that made their operations much slower than those of modern miners. No great advance of their work was possible during the working time of each season. And yet, remains of their mining works have been discovered wherever mines have been opened in our day. And as previously stated, they are known to exist in heavy forests where the modern mining works have not yet been established. Check, 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 check. Okay, let's scroll up while I'm breaking here. Check. There's nothing to indicate that they had settlements anywhere in the mining region. Colonel Whittlesey and others whose study of the subject gives their opinion much weight believe the mound builders went up from the settlements farther south in the summers, remained in the copper region through the season, and worked the mines in organized companies until the advance of winter terminated their operations. Colonel Whittlesey says, as yet, no remains of cities, graves, domiciles, or highways have been found in the copper region, and adds, as the race appears to have been farther advanced in civilization than their successors, whom we call aborigines, they probably had better means of transportation than bark canoes. It may be said also that the accumulations called wealth were necessary to make this regular and systematic mining possible. Without these, they could not have provided the supplies of every kind required to sustain organized companies of miners through a single season. A great many summers must have passed away. Funny, this copper mine thing, I always thought it was kind of a newer kind of theory, but it's come up in 2 or 3 or 4 of the books that I've read about how, impressive these old ancient copper mines were, and, it's just I don't know, I just feel like it doesn't really get mainstream attention, but it's been written about a lot in the 1800s. It's not just some fresh new theory. Okay, why is that record level going? Okay, that should be fine there. Check, check. A great many summers must have passed away before such companies of miners with all needed tools and supplies could have made their works so extensive by means of such methods as they were able to use. They probably occupied the country on the Gulf and lower Mississippi much longer than any other portion of the Great Valley. Their oldest and latest abandoned settlements appear to have been in this region, where we may reasonably suppose they continued to dwell long after they were driven from the Ohio Valley and other places at the north. The Natchez Indians found settled on the lower Mississippi may have been a degenerate. Yes, copper is a great electricity conductor. I do think there's something to that and the old technologies that we don't know a lot about. So that's a weird degenerate remnant. The Natchez Indians found settled on the lower Mississippi may have been a degenerate remnant of the Mound Builders. They differed in language, customs, and condition from all other Indians in the country. Okay, where am I? And their own traditions connected them with Mexico. Like the Mexicans, they had temples or sacred buildings in which the perpetual fire was maintained. Each of their villages was furnished with a sacred building of this kind. They had also peculiarities of social and political organization different from those of other tribes. They were sun worshippers and claimed that their chief derived his descent from the sun. The Natchez were more settled and civilized than the other Indians, and in most respects seemed like another race. One learned investigator, learned Nahuatl, One learned investigator classes them with the Nahuatl or Toltec race, thinks they came from Mexico, and finds that, like the ancient people of Panuco and Cohuacan, they had the phallic ceremonies among their religious observances. Their history cannot be given, and there is little or nothing but conjecture to connect them with the Mound Builders. The Natchez were exterminated in 1730 by the French, whom they had treated with great kindness. Of the few who escaped death, some were received among the Chickasaws and Muskogees. Of the few who escaped Of the few who escaped death, some were received among the Chickasaws and Muskogees, but more were sent to Santo Domingo and sold as slaves. Let me redo that. Of the few who escaped death, some were received among the Chickasaws and Muskogees, but more were sent to Santo Domingo and sold as slaves. No view that can be taken of the relics left by the Mound Builders will permit us to check. No view that can be taken of the relics left by the Mound Builders will permit us to believe that their stay in the country was short. Any hypothesis based on the shortest possible estimate of the time must count the years by centuries. All right, I am just going to I'm going to save this because last time I just recorded all these chapters at once and I had to go back and like resave them and edit them. So I am just going to quickly save this while I take a break. The Antiquity of the Mound Builders, number 2. And then I can just start fresh and then I don't have to go back into it later. Ancient America, number 2. The Mound Builders. I just saved these all I end up saving them all as paragraphs because they need to be in a file that's separated that way for the audiobooks in general. So now we're getting into chapter 3, which is and then I have this obsession to check to make sure it's been saved before I close that file because I don't want to keep a file in Audacity as well. So now I'll just close that down and restart another one. And I'll share the screen again. We are all sun worshippers, knowingly or unknowingly, sun descendants. Jesus representing the sun in all religions, one astrotheologies. Yeah, I agree, Sati. And I think it's beginning to click with me finally after years of study that it's like they were, they knew about this cataclysm that happened. And wouldn't you, if a cataclysm happened, no, I'm not familiar with Halton Hotema books and writings. I'll have to check it out. I'll keep a note of that. But you would think that you would really pay attention to the sun and moon after a cataclysm. To see like like the other book I read in here, the Ragnarok one. The sun disappeared. It talks about the physical effects of the cataclysm. So you would think that you'd want to start measuring the sun and the moon to make sure that you're out of the cataclysm or what happens. Like you would start to track it for your survival, basically, or just to see if things are working again properly. All right, here we go. Chapter 3. Who were the mound builders? Check, check, check. Chapter 3. Who were the mound builders? This ancient people, whose remains indicate unity and civilization, must have been organized as a nation with a central administration which all recognized. They must have had a national name, but nobody can tell certainly what it was. No record or tradition has preserved it unless discovery of it can be made in a national designation found without clear explanation in the old books and traditions of Central America and applied to some country situated at a distance from that. Let me just scroll down on that, redo that sentence. Without, where am I? Who? It's Lapalan. Who? Let me just check check that too. I'm gonna have to without clear explanation and applied. Where am I? Without clear explanation and the. Without clear explanation. Okay, I'm gonna have to go back a ways here. Redo this. No record or tradition. Check. No record or tradition has preserved it unless discovery of it can be made in a national designation found without clear explanation in the old books and traditions of Central America and applied to some country situated at a distance from that part of the continent in the northeast. Okay, I'm gonna have to check pronunciation of this Tlapalan, who. I should know that, but I don't. Who? Check with my assistant here. Way, Tlapalan. Way, Tlapalan. Nawas, Toltecs, Brasseur de Bourbourg. Okay, I think I know the rest of it. Those old books, these old books and traditions mention Huehue Tlapalan as a distant northeastern country from which the Nawas or Toltecs came to Mexico, and Brasseur de Bourbourg, who has translated one of the old books and given much attention to others, supposes the Toltecs and the mound builders to be the same people, or did suppose this previous to the appearance of his Atlantic theory. But this point will be more fully considered when we come to the Central American antiquities. Some antiquaries, let me just redo that quickly. Some antiquaries suggest that the mound builders were the people called Alagui. Should I just check that quickly? Alagawi? Let me just double check that. Some Allegheny. Thanks, assistant. Check. Dean Radin and Walter Russell, the authors of both. Yeah, I've heard of Walter. We've had Dean Radin on our podcast before, the Grimerica show. Hilton Hotema, I'm not too sure about, but I'll check it out. Yeah, Dean's book, Real Magic, was pretty cool. Allegheny. Now I've lost my pronunciation. I should probably not pay attention to the chats. Allegheny. Okay, Allegheny. Some antiquaries suggest that the mound builders were the people called Allegheny in old traditions of the Iroquois, but we have nothing to make this very probable. The Iroquois were somewhat superior to the other great family of barbarous Indians in organization for the business of fighting. There are some reasons for believing they came to the lake regions and the Ohio Valley much earlier than the Algonquin branch of the wild. It's right at the end, right? It's right at the end. Always. There are some reasons right at the end of the sentence, but I need to redo it. There we go. There are some reasons for believing that they came to the lake regions and the Ohio Valley much earlier than the Algonquin branch of the wild Indian race. It is permissible at least to conjecture, if one feels inclined to do so, that it was the Iroquois migration from the Northwest, or that of the great family to which the Iroquois family belonged, which expelled the mound builders from their border settlements, cut them off from the copper mines, and finally pushed them down the Mississippi. But nothing more than conjecture is possible in this case, and the supposition gives the Iroquois migration a greater antiquity than may be allowable. Moreover, the traditionary lore of the wild Indians had nothing to say of the mound builders, who appear to have been as unknown and mysterious to these Indians as they are to us. Not ancestors of the wild Indians. Some inquirers, not always without hesitation, suggest that the Indians inhabiting the United States 200 years ago were degenerate descendants of the mound builders. The history of the world shows that civilized communities may lose their enlightenment and sink to a condition of barbarism. But the degraded descendants of a civilized people usually retain traditional recollections of their ancestors or some traces of the lost civilization, perceptible in their customs and their legendary lore. The barbarism of the wild Indians of North America had nothing of this kind. It was original barbarism. There was nothing to indicate that either the Indians inhabiting our part of the continent or their ancestors, near or remote, had ever been civilized, even in the extent of becoming capable of settled life and organized industry. And besides, the constant tradition of these Indians, supported by concurring circumstantial evidence, appears to warrant the belief that they came to this part of the continent originally from the west or northwest, at a period too late to connect them in this way with the mound builders. 200 years ago, the valley of the Mississippi and the regions east of it were occupied by two great families of Indians, the Iroquois and the Algonquins, each divided into separate tribes. Between these two families, there was a radical difference of language. The Indians of New England were Algonquins. The Iroquois dealt chiefly in New York and around Lake Erie, from Niagara to Detroit, although separate communities of the group to which they immediately belonged were found in other places, such as the Dakotas and Winnebagos of the West, and the isolated Tuscaroras. Tuscaroras? Tuscaroras. Man, I just jumbled that right at the end again. Fuck. Excuse my language. Whoops. Although separate. Where was I? Although, yeah, I'm gonna have to go back further than that. Let's see here. The Indians of New England were Algonquins. Dakotas and Winnebagos, where's the other one? Tuscaroras. The Iroquois dwelt chiefly in New York and around Lake Erie, from Niagara to Detroit, although separate communities of the group to which they immediately belonged were found in other places, such as the Dakotas and Winnebagos of the West and the isolated Tuscaroras of the Carolinas. Mr. Lewis H. Morgan, who has discussed Indian migrations in several interesting papers printed in the North American Review, thinks the Iroquois were separated very early from the same original stem which produced the great Dakota family. The Algonquins were spread most widely over the country when it was first visited by Europeans. Among all these Indians, there was a tradition that their ancestors came from a distant region in the Northwest, and this tradition is accepted as true by those who have studied them most carefully. Mr. Morgan supposes they came across the continent and estimates that not less than 1,000 years must have passed between the departure of the various groups of the Algonquin family from a common center in the Northwest and the condition in which they were found 200 years ago. When Europeans began to explore North America, this family had become divided into several branches, and each of these branches had a modified form of the common language, which in turn had developed several dialects. A long period was required to effect so great a change. But whatever estimate of the time may be accepted, it seems to be a fact that the Algonquins came to the Mississippi Valley long after the Mound Builders left it, and also later than the Iroquois or Dakota family. That the Iroquois proceeded. No problem, Sadie. Don't worry about it. There we go. Scroll up while I'm taking a break. That the Iroquois preceded the Algonquins at the east appears to be indicated by the relative position of the two families in this part of the country. Mr. Parkman, in his work on the Jesuits in North America, describes it as follows. Like a great island in the midst of the Algonquins lay the country of tribes speaking the generic tongue of the Iroquois. There is no trace or probability of any direct relationship whatever between the mound builders and the barbarous Indians found in the country. The wild Indians of this continent had never known such a condition as that of the mound builders. They had nothing in common with it. In Africa, Asia, and elsewhere, among the more uncultivated families of the human race, there is not as really much. I have to redo that one too. At least it wasn't at the very end. In Africa, Asia, and elsewhere among the more uncultivated families of the human race, there is not as much really original barbalism. In Africa, Asia, and elsewhere among the more uncultivated families of the human race, there is not as much really original barbarism as some anthropologists are inclined to assume. But there can be no serious doubt that the wild Indians of North America were original barbarians, born of a stock which had never, at any time, been either civilized or closely associated with the influences of civilization. I would say, this might sound racist to some people, but, they were probably better off without influences of civilization. I mean, when I look back at them, it's too bad that we had to civilize all of this. It's funny, their perception of what was like, good or proper or progress. It's like, oh, now it's more like devolution. And you could argue. It's funny how they said that they had to study all this stuff, Some of the pottery, and yet we're not allowed to ask questions about our ancient past. Some of the pottery and wrought ornaments of the mound builders is equal in finish and beauty to the finest manufactured by the ancient Peruvians. They constructed artificial pounds. Artificial ponds? Man, I wonder if some of this pottery is the same as some of those ancient ones that they found in Egypt. I don't think they're quite as accurate, quite as precise. Where was I? They constructed artificial ponds like the aqueducts in Central America, They used sun-dried brick, especially at the south, where walls of this material have been discovered supporting some of the mounds and embankments. They manufactured cloth, but their intelligence, skill, and civilized ways are shown not only by their constructions and manufactures, but also by their mining works. Who could imagine the Iroquois or the Algonquins working the copper mines with such intelligence and skill, and such a combination of systematic and persistent industry? They had no tradition of such a condition of life, no trace of it. It is absurd to suppose a relationship or a connection of any kind between the original barbarism of these Indians and the civilization of the mound builders. The two peoples were entirely distinct and separate from each other. If they really belonged to the same race, which is extremely doubtful, we must go back through unnumbered ages to find their common origin and the date of their separation. Brereton's story. Those who seek to identify the mound builders with the barbarous Indians find nothing that will support their hypothesis. Nevertheless, some of them have tried very strangely to give it aid by one or two quotations from early voyagers to America. The most important are taken from Brereton's account of Gosnold's voyage in 1602. The following occurred on the coast of Maine. 8 Indians in a Basque shallop, with mast and sail, an iron grapple, and a kettle, came boldly aboard us, one of them apparelled with a waistcoat and breeches of black serge, made after our sea fashion, hose and shoes on his feet. All the rest, saving one that had a pair of breeches of blue cloth, were naked. It is known that the Basques were accustomed to send fishing vessels to the northeastern coast of America long before this continent was discovered by Columbus. They continued to do this after the discovery. These Indians had evidently become well acquainted with the Basques and therefore did not fear to approach Gosnold's ship. Probably some of them had been employed on board Basque fishing vessels. Certainly their boat and apparel came from the Basque fishermen and did not show them to be mound builders. Of the Indians on the coast of Massachusetts, Brereton says, they had great store of copper, some very red, some of a paler color. None of them but have chains, earrings, or collars of this metal. They had some of their arrows herewith, much like our broad arrowheads, very workmanly made. Their chains are many hollow pieces cemented together, each piece of the bigness of one of our reeds, a finger in length, 10 or 12 of them together on a string, which they wear about their necks. Their collars they wear about their bodies like bandoliers, a handful broad, all hollow pieces like the other, but somewhat shorter, 400 pieces in a collar, very fine and evenly set together. He adds, I am persuaded they have great store of flax, growing upon the main, as also mines and many other rich commodities which we, wanting time, could not possibly discover. If all this had been true, it would not serve the purpose for which it is quoted. For remains of the mound builders have never existed in Massachusetts, and we should necessarily suppose these Indians had procured copper and copper ornaments by trading with the Basques or with other. My mouth just couldn't do it. For remains of the mound. I have to go back to here. If all this had. If all this. Oh, okay. Go all the way back. I'll scroll up while I can. If all this had been true, it would not serve the purpose for which it is quoted. Excuse me. If all this had been true, it would not serve the purpose for which it is quoted. For remains of the mound builders have never existed in Massachusetts, and we should necessarily suppose these Indians had procured copper and copper ornaments by trading with the Basques or with other French voyagers. If only 1 or 2 Indians had been represented as wearing ornaments made of copper, this explanation could be readily accepted. But he avers that they had a great store of copper and adds, none of them but have chains, earrings, or collars of this metal. Therefore, his statement is incredible. The following considerations will show why it must not be regarded as honest, unadorned truth. One, those interested in Gosnold's voyage aimed to establish a colony on that coast, and all who served them or were controlled by them were easily moved to tell seductive stories of the country upon the main. The chief aim of Brereton's account of this voyage was to incite emigration. Therefore, he gave this wonderfully colored account of mines, flax growing, copper chains and collars, and other rich commodities among the wild Indians of Massachusetts. Settlements on that coast, it was believed, would bring profit to those in whose interests he wrote. Gosnold actually proposed at that time to establish a colony on one of the islands in Buzzards Bay, and had with him 20 men who were expected to stay as colonists, but finally refused to do so. He saw a great deal of the Indians and knew much more of their actual condition than the story admits. Number two, 18 years later, the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth from the Mayflower. Neither copper mines nor flax fields were then known in Massachusetts. No Indians with great store of copper and flax and covered with copper ornaments were seen or heard of by the Pilgrims, either at that time or afterward. In 1602, Brereton, or any other writer employed to write in such a way as would promote emigration, could tell such stories and romance freely concerning the Indians without fear of contradiction. Afterward, when the actual barbarism of the Indian tribes in New England and other parts of the country had become generally known, no one could describe any of these Indians as successful miners and flax growers, and assert gravely that they had such stores of copper that none of them lacked great abundance of copper, chains, earrings, collars, and the like, without being laughed at. Brereton's story must be regarded as an invention designed to serve a special purpose, but not warranted by anything seen during the voyage he describes. Neither in New England nor anywhere else in our part of the continent did the early colonists find Indians who worked copper mines and had great store of copper. What Brereton says was not true of any Indians known to our first colonists or to their successors. It corresponds to no reality found in any part of our territory during the last 250 years. Therefore, to use his story in support of an absurd hypothesis is not a satisfactory proceeding. Okay, here we go. American Ethnology. It may be true that all the Aboriginal peoples found inhabiting North and South America, save the Esquimalt, belonged originally to the same race. Some writers assume it to be true, although it seems strongly improbable, not to say impossible. If they were all of the same race, time and development under different conditions of life had divided this race into at least two extremely unlike branches. The wild Indians of North America were profoundly different from the ancient people of Central America and Peru. The Pueblo, or village Indians of New Mexico, have scarcely anything in common with the Apaches, Comanches, and Sioux. Even the uncivilized Indians of South America are different from those in the United States. Our wild Indians have more resemblance to the nomadic Koraks and Chokis found in eastern Siberia, throughout the region that extends to Bering's Strait, than to any people on this continent. Interesting. Take a quick break. Those who have seen these Siberians, traveled with them, and lived in their tents have found the resemblance very striking. But I infer from what they say that the Korak or Chokchi is superior to the Indian. See Kennan's Tent Life in Siberia. Mr. Lewis H. Morgan finds evidence that the American Aborigines had a common origin in what he calls their systems of consanguinity and affinity. If it can be made to appear beyond question that these systems prevail and are identical everywhere from Patagonia to the Arctic zone, his argument will have great force. But this has not yet been seen. But this has not yet been shown. He says, The Indian nations, from the Atlantic to the Rocky Mountains and from the Arctic Sea to the Gulf of Mexico, with the exception of the Esquimalt, have the same system. It is elaborate and complicated in its general form and details, and while It is elaborate and complicated in its general form and details, and while deviations from uniformity occur in the system of different stocks, the radical features are, in the main, constant. This identity in the essential characteristics of a system so remarkable tends to show that it must have been transmitted with the blood to each stock from a common original source. It affords the strongest evidence yet obtained of unity in origin of the Indian nations within the region defined. But unity in race among wild Indians found within the region specified would be sufficiently manifest without this evidence. That the same system of consanguinity and affinity with precisely the same features of identity ever was extended over the whole continent remains unproved. The supposed traces of it among the Pueblos are by no means clear. A more complete and accurate research is required to show that identically the same system has ever existed anywhere between the United States and Patagonia. A system not wholly unlike it, though not the same, might grow up anywhere in widely separated tribal communities of barbarous peoples without doing anything more than the tribal system itself to show a common origin and race. The Aborigines of America may have been originally all of the same race. There are some considerations in favor of this hypothesis which have been used by writers entitled to great respect. But it cannot yet be claimed with reason that they have been able to settle this question beyond the reach of doubt, even in their own minds. Therefore, to speak moderately, it would be premature to assume that the mound builders were even remotely of the same race with the wild Indians, from whom they were so different in all we know of them. The attempt to establish this hypothesis of identity in race has given rise to a tendency to underrate the development of the ancient people of Mexico and Central America, and to lower the estimate of their attainments sufficiently to bring them within reach of close relationship to the wild Indians. Check, check. The difficulty being reduced in this way, there follows an attempt to get rid of it entirely and establish connection between these unlike peoples by talking of semi-village Indians. But the hypothesis used in this case is not well warranted by facts. Such semi-village Indians, as are supposed, really standing halfway between the savages and the Pueblos, and being actually savages half developed into Pueblos, have never had a clearly defined and unquestionable existence here since the continent became known to Europeans. In the border region between the northern wild Indians and the old Mexican race, there are exceptional communities formed by association or mixture, but we cannot reasonably give them the significance claimed for the supposed semi-village Indians. Moreover, those exceptional communities are usually pueblos whose habits have been changed and their civilization lessened by association with wild Indians or in some other way. The Navajos began their present condition by fleeing to the mountains from the Spaniards. The mound builders, who must have been still more than the pueblos, unlike the barbarous Indians, cannot be explained by any reference whatsoever to such communities. If they were of the same race, they were far from being the same people. Some ethnologists, whose suggestions are entitled to respectful attention, whether accepted or rejected, specify. Should have had that one. Should have had that one. Some specify considerations which they believe forbid us to remain to regard ancient. Excuse me. Some ethnologists, whose suggestions are entitled to respectful attention, whether accepted or rejected, specify considerations which they believe forbid us to regard the ancient Mexicans and the northern wild Indians as identical in race. Yep. Excuse me. They point to the well known fact that the fauna of the American continent below the northern frontier of Mexico is remarkably different from that between this line and the Arctic Sea. At the North America bound at the North America At the North, America abounds in species similar to those of Europe and Asia, with some admixture of forms wholly American, while at the South, the Old World forms disappear, and the fauna of the whole region between Mexico and Cape Horn becomes as peculiar as that of Australia. The explanation given is that during the glacial period, the larger part of North America, like northern Asia and Europe, was covered with ice and partly submerged, and that the fauna found in this part of North America was introduced after the glacial period by immigration from Asia and Europe over connecting lands or islands at the northwest and the northeast, and perhaps by some migration from the south. The fauna at the south, meanwhile, remaining very much as it was before, with very little change through later migrations from the north. Professor Huxley called attention to this subject in a brief address to the London Ethnological Society in 1869. After stating the case, he presented the following queries and suggestions. The Austro-Columbian fauna as a whole, therefore, existed antecedently to the glacial epoch. Did man form part of that fauna? To this profoundly interesting question, no positive answer can be given. But the discovery of human remains associated with extinct animals in the caves of Brazil by Lund lends some color to the supposition. Assuming this supposition to be correct, we should have to look in the human population of America, as in the fauna generally, for an indigenous or Austro-Columbian element and an immigrant or archeological element. He then suggests that the Esquimalt may now represent the immigrant element, and the old Mexican and South American race, that which was indigenous, and that the red Indians of North America may have appeared originally as a mixture of these two races. He adds very reasonably, it is easy to suggest such problems as these, but quite impossible, in the present state of our knowledge, to solve them. Who were the mound builders? They were unquestionably American Aborigines and not immigrants from another continent. That appears to me the most reasonable suggestion, which assumes that the mound builders came originally from Mexico and Central America. It explains many facts connecting It explains many facts connected with their remains. In the Great Valley, their most populous settlements were at the south. Coming from Mexico and Central America, they would begin their settlements on the Gulf Coast and afterward advance gradually up the river to the Ohio Valley. It seems evident that they came by this route, and their remains show that their only connection with the coast was at the south. Their settlements did not reach the coast at any other point. Their constructions were similar in design and arrangement to those found in Mexico and Central America. Like the Mexicans and Central Americans, they had many of the smaller structures known as Teotihuacan. Like, let me redo that quickly. Like the Mexicans and Central Americans, they had many of the smaller structures known as teocallis. And sorry, it's my phone going off. Like the Mexicans and Central Americans, they had many of the smaller structures known as teocallis, and also large high mounds with level summits reached by great flights of steps. Pyramidal platforms or foundations for important edifices appear in both regions and are very much alike. In Central America, important edifices were built of hewn stone and can still be examined in their ruins. The mound builders, like some of the ancient people of Mexico and Yucatan, used wood, sun-dried brick, or some other material that could not resist decay. There is evidence that they used timber for building purposes. In one of the mounds opened in the Ohio Valley, 2 chambers were found with remains of the timber on which the walls were made and with arched ceilings precisely like those in Central America, even to the overlapping stones. Chambers have been found in some of the Central American and Mexican mounds, but their hewn stones were used for the walls. In both regions, the elevated and terraced foundations remain and can be compared. I have already called attention to the close resemblance between them, but the fact is so important in any endeavor to explain the mound builders that I must bring it to view here. Consider then that elevated and terraced foundations for important buildings are peculiar to the ancient Mexicans and Central Americans, that this method of construction, which with them was the rule, is found nowhere else, save that terraced elevations carefully constructed and precisely like theirs in the form and appearance occupy a chief place among the remaining works of the mound builders. The use made of these foundations at Palenque, Uxmal, and Chichen Itza shows the purpose for which they were constructed in the Mississippi Valley. The resemblance is not due to chance. The explanation appears to me very manifest. This method of construction was brought to the Mississippi Valley from Mexico and Central America. The ancient inhabitants of that region and the mound builders being the same people in race and also in civilization when it was brought here. A very large proportion of the old structures in Ohio and farther south called mounds, namely those which are low in proportion to their horizontal extent, are terraced foundations for buildings, and if they were situated in Yucatan, Guatemala, and southern Mexico, they would never be mistaken for anything else. The high mounds, also in the 2 regions, are remarkably alike. In both cases, they are pyramidal in shape and have level summits of considerable extent, which were reached by means of stairways on the outside. The Great Mound at Chichen Itza is 75 feet high and has on its summit a ruined stone edifice. That at Uxmal is 60 feet high and has a similar ruin on its summit. That at Mayapan is 60 feet high. The edifice placed on its summit has disappeared. The Great Mound at Miamisburg, Ohio is 68 feet high, and that at Grave Creek, West Virginia is 75 feet high. Both had level summits and stairways on the outside, but no trace of any structure remains on them. All these mounds were constructed for religiousness. Religiousness. Check. All these mounds were constructed for religious uses, and they are, in their way, as much alike as any 5 Gothic churches. Could these works of the mound builders be restored to the condition in which they were when the country was filled with their busy communities, we should doubtless see great edifices, similar in style to those in Yucatan, standing on the upper terraces of all the low and extended mounds, and smaller structures on the high mounds, such as those above named. There would seem to be an extension of ancient Mexico and Central America through Texas into the Mississippi and Ohio valleys. And so, if there were no massive stonework in the old ruins of those countries, it might seem that the mound builders' works were anciently extended into them by way of Texas. The fact that the settlements and works of the mound builders extended through Texas and across the Rio Grande indicates very plainly their connection with the people of Mexico and goes far to explain their origin. We have other evidence of intercourse between the two peoples, for the obsidian dug from the mounds, and perhaps the porphyry also, can be explained only by supposing commercial relations between them. We cannot suppose the mound builders to have come from any other part of North America, for nowhere else north of the isthmus was there any other people capable of producing such works as they left in the places where they dwelt. Beyond the relics of the mound builders themselves, no traces of the former existence of such a people have been discovered in any part of North America save Mexico and Central America. And I was on a good roll there. I'm going to have to redo that whole one. I was losing focus. Check. Beyond the relics of the mound builders themselves, no traces of the former existence of such a people have been discovered in any part of North America, save Mexico and Central America, and districts immediately connected with them. At the same time, it is not unreasonable to suppose the civilized people of these regions extended their settlements through Texas and also migrated across the Gulf into the Mississippi Valley. In fact, the connection of settlements by way of Texas appears to have been unbroken from Ohio to Mexico. This colonizing extension of the old Mexican race must have taken place at a remote period in the past. For what has been said of the antiquity of the mound builders shows that a very long period, far more than 2,000 years it may be, must have elapsed since they left the valley of the Ohio. Perhaps they found the country most unoccupied. Perhaps they found the country mostly unoccupied and saw there but little of any other people until an eruption of warlike barbarians came upon them from the northwest. In speculating on the causes of their withdrawal after centuries of occupation, absolute certainty is impossible, and we have no means of going much beyond mere conjecture. We may suppose, as most probable, that an influx of barbarians destroyed their border settlements, interrupted their mining operations, and caused them to retire gradually toward the Gulf. What about the cataclysm? What about the flood? Is that in your hypothesis? Fragments of their communities may have become incorporated with the barbarous tribes. This conjecture has been used to explain certain exceptional peculiarities noticed in some of the wild Indian tribes. For instance, it has been suggested that the Mandan Indians were a separated and lost fragment of the mound building people, they being noticeably unlike other Indians in many respects, lighter in color and peculiar in manners and customs. What is conjectured may be true, but we have no means of proving its truth. That the Mandans were like what a lost community of mound builders might have become by degeneration through mixture and association with barbarians may be supposed, but the actual history of that remarkable tribe might give its peculiarities a very different explanation. The Mandans were supposed to be a branch of Dakotas. They may have been, like the Navajos, a changed community of Pueblos, but any attempt to explain them by means of conjecture is useless. The supposition that the Toltecs and the mound builders were the same people seems to me not improbable. The reasons for it will be stated when we come to a discussion of the antiquities, books, and traditions of Central America. I will only say here that according to dates given in the Central American books, the Toltecs came from Huehue Tlalopan. Huehue? Wee? Was it Huehue? Now I got to go to my assistant and see what I said about that. Huehue. Way with the Huehue Tlalopan. Where am I? Huehue Tlapalan. Tlapalan. I will only. I think this is almost the end of the chapter. Yes, it is. It's been a long read today. I will only say here that according to dates given in the Central American books, the Toltecs came from Huehue Tlapalan, a distant country in the northeast, long previous to the Christian era. They played a great part and had a long career in Mexico previous to the rise of their successors in power, the Aztecs, who were overthrown by the Spaniards. And that's it. So probably this weekend at some point, maybe I'll read, I can't do tomorrow, but chapter 4, Mexico and Central America. It's going to go on. So for a few chapters. So there it is. There you have it. Lots of pictures in the first chapter. No pictures in this chapter for some reason. But yeah, thanks for listening and watching. Smash that like button, subscribe, share it to all your friends, all that stuff. There's more on our live tab of the other book I read, the Ragnarok one, which was a super underrated book. Thanks. See you, Sati. Have a good weekend. And yeah, thanks for watching, listening. Get all our books in Audible, Spotify, or this YouTube channel. There's a bunch of free ones in here too. So be sure to share. There's some really good stuff in our catalog. And thanks. Have a good day. Love ya.